My name is Eliza Thompson. I'm 74 years old, and I've lived in this house for over 4 decades. Every photograph on the walls, every creak in the floorboards carries the echoes of a life built with love, struggle, and clubbin'. My husband John and I raised our only child, Brian, in this very home. But one day, none of that seemed to matter. It was late afternoon, the light filtering softly through the living room curtains. I was bringing a tray of coffee and cookies to John's study, where Brian and his wife Danielle had joined me earlier to discuss estate matters. Or so I thought. When I reached the doorway, Brian stood there, blocking my view into the room. He didn't smile. His expression was firm, almost rehearsed. "This is between family, Mom," he said. "We'll let you know later." I blinked. I laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of joke. But his face didn't change. Not even a flicker of warmth or humor. He gently closed the door, and I was left standing in the hallway alone. Just like that 45 years of marriage, motherhood, and devotion reduced to nothing more than a polite dismissal. I wasn't even granted the dignity of staying in the room. I stood there in silence, surrounded by framed family portraits, photographs I had taken, printed, and hung myself, holidays I had cooked for, birthdays I had planned. And yet, at that moment, I wasn't part of their definition of family anymore. That was the first real crack, the moment where the illusion that love would always protect me began to fall apart. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked to the kitchen, set the tray down, and poured myself a cup of tea, trying to keep my hands from shaking. But inside, something began to shift. A quiet awakening. This wasn't just grief. This wasn't just loneliness. This was erasure. And I was not going to disappear quietly. John and I met in the summer of 1973. I was 22, wearing a yellow cotton dress I had sewn myself. He told me I looked like sunshine, and from that moment on, that's what he called me. Sunshine. Even in the final weeks of his illness, when his voice was barely a whisper, he would reach for my hand and say, "Sunshine, you still light up the room." We built this house piece by piece, laid the tile in the kitchen ourselves, painted the bedroom walls one Saturday morning with music playing in the background. It wasn't just a house. It was our story written in wood, paint, and laughter. Our son Brian was our miracle. After years of trying in a complicated pregnancy, I held him in my arms, afraid to blink in case something happened. We poured everything into giving him the best we could. When he decided to pursue business school, John and I refinanced the house to help pay tuition. Later, when he launched his first startup, we quietly dipped into John's retirement fund to help him through the rough first year. We never kept a ledger. We never asked to be paid back. That's what parents do, we told ourselves that more times than I can count. And for a while, he made us proud. He visited on holidays. He brought Danielle, his wife, to family dinners. He sent flowers on my birthday. But slowly, things started to change. The phone calls became shorter. The hugs felt less warm. Conversations turned transactional, and somehow even family became something to be managed, scheduled, optimized. I told myself he was just busy, that he meant well. Mothers do that. We explain away the silence, make room for disappointment, and hold tight to the belief that love is still there even if unspoken. Then John got sick, pancreatic cancer, fast and cruel. From diagnosis to hospice, it was less than 10 months. Through it all, I never left his side. But Brian, he stopped by when he could, always with his laptop, always checking emails, always whispering with Danielle in the hallway. And I started to wonder, had we raised a stranger? It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where sunlight falls in slanted lines across the kitchen table. John was thinner than I'd ever seen him. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for mine. "Eliza," he said softly, "I need to talk to you about something serious." I thought he was going to mention a new treatment option, or maybe ask about pain medication. But instead, he looked me in the eye and said, "I've updated the will." I froze, my throat tightened. "Brian, he's changed," John continued. "He doesn't look at you the way a son should look at his mother." I tried to interrupt to defend our son, but John gently shook his head. "He and Danielle, I've heard things. Conversations they didn't mean for me to hear. About money. About the house. About what happens after." I wanted to say it was stress. That grief can twist words and intentions. But John saw through the noise. "He's positioning himself," he said plainly. "You need to be ready. Promise me when I'm gone, you'll stand up for yourself." I nodded, but truthfully, I didn't understand. I didn't want to. 2 weeks later, as he lay in bed, weaker than ever, he took my hand and pressed something into my palm, a small brass key. "Only after I'm gone," he whispered. "You'll know when." I didn't ask questions. I just kissed his forehead and sat beside him until he fell asleep. After John passed, the house felt like a museum. His slippers stayed tucked under the bed. His coffee mug sat on the drying rack for weeks. I slept on my side of the bed, not because I needed the space, but because I couldn't bear to step into the emptiness he left behind. Brian came more often after the funeral. He brought legal documents, spoke in clipped, professional tones about efficiency, and scheduled meetings with lawyers. I was still numb, still holding my grief like a second skin. Then came the day he blocked me at the study door. And for the first time, I remembered the brass key, tucked deep in a drawer. Waiting. The day Brian shut the door in my face, something inside me cracked. I stood in the hallway, holding a tray of coffee I'd carefully prepared, using the good china. I had thought we'd sit together, like a family, but now I realized that family had become a word with conditions. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of tea. My hands trembled as I lifted the kettle, but I didn't spill a drop. I sat at the table, surrounded by familiar things: John's reading glasses still on the windowsill, the framed photo of Brian as a boy, laughing in a Superman cape. I stared at that photo longer than I meant to. That moment wasn't just grief. It wasn't just the ache of widowhood. It was a realization. I was being erased, gently, quietly. The next morning, I opened the drawer where I had hidden the brass key. I held it in my palm for a long time, the way you might hold a match before lighting it. That afternoon, Brian came by as if nothing had happened. He brought croissants from the bakery I liked, though, like always, not the kind I actually preferred. "We're almost finished wrapping up the estate," he said, placing the paper bag on the counter. Danielle scrolled on her phone from the hallway, barely looking up. They were waiting, not just for a legal process to complete, but for something more. Control. That same day, I drove to Valley Trust Bank, just off Cedar Lane. John had told me exactly where to go, box number 209. The manager led me into a quiet room and handed me a small metal container. Inside, a manila envelope with my name, a USB drive, and a leather folder labeled Power of Attorney and Financial Docs. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. At the top, a notarized will, signed 6 months before John passed. He had left everything to me: the house, the investments, the pension. Brian's share, conditional and small. John had seen it coming, the shift, the charm backed by calculation. I drove home in silence, the folder on the passenger seat. And for the first time in weeks, the house didn't just feel empty, it felt alert. As if it too was waiting. That evening, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the brass key beside me, the folder from the bank still unopened on purpose. I wasn't ready to read more, not yet, but I couldn't bring myself to go to bed, either. The silence in the house was too loud. It pressed against my chest like a weight. At around midnight, I picked up the USB drive and walked to John's study. His favorite lamp, the one with the brass pull chain, still sat on the desk. I turned it on and plugged the USB into the laptop. The screen flickered, then a video began to play. There was John. Older, thinner, but still him. "Sunshine," he said, "if you're watching this, then I'm already gone. But I need to tell you the truth." His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. He took a breath and continued. "I've seen what Brian and Danielle are doing. I didn't want to believe it either. But the signs, they're everywhere. I started hearing them talk about transferring the house before Mom forgets things and making arrangements. They think they're protecting you, but they're not. They're removing you." I pressed pause. Then play. He explained how he had quietly hired a financial advisor to look into our accounts. Transactions had started shifting. Emails had been sent from addresses I didn't recognize. A line of credit had been opened in my name. Signatures that looked close to mine but weren't mine. And then John said something I'll never forget. "They're not waiting until you need help. They're planning to help themselves. You're not a person to them anymore, Eliza. You're a liability." The video ended. I sat in the dim glow of the desk lamp, blinking at the still frame of John's face. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. But mostly I felt still. Cold, like my body had stepped out of time. The next day, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find a real estate agent and a sharply dressed man in a blue blazer. "Hi, we're here for the showing," she chirped. "The agent said we could come a little early." I blinked. "Showing?" She looked confused. The man pulled out his phone. "West 134 Oak Ridge Lane. Your son Michael, sorry Brian," he said this was the right address. I closed the door without another word. I stood in my own foyer, the one John and I had painted together, and realized they were selling my house. Not later. Not someday. Now. And I hadn't even been told. Not even asked. To them, I was already gone. After the showing, I didn't yell. I didn't call Brian or Danielle. I didn't march into their offices or demand answers. Instead, I sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where John and I once planned vacations, balanced checkbooks, and dreamed up new flower beds for spring, and I began to listen, to watch, to wait. Things shifted quickly after that. Danielle stopped calling me Mom. She started using my full name Eliza like a polite stranger might. Brian no longer asked how I was sleeping, if I needed groceries, or how I felt. He only talked in numbers. Property taxes are rising. The market's hot, Mom, you'd get a great price. It's not sustainable for you to stay here alone. Every sentence sounded helpful. Every word was draped in concern. But the subtext was clear. You're not meant to stay. I started checking the mailbox twice a day, not because I was waiting for a birthday card or a package, but because I was afraid of what might arrive. 3 days later, it came. A letter from a lender I didn't recognize. A notice of non-payment on a personal line of credit in my name. I opened the envelope with trembling hands and stared at the balance. Tens of thousands. I went to the drawer where I had placed the documents from the bank and compared the signatures. They were close. Too close? But not mine. They had forged my name. Used my identity. Taken out loans against the roof over my head. And that was when something in me turned. I had spent my whole life being dependable, the one who said yes, the one who cooked, cleaned, consoled, who stood quietly in the background so others could shine. But not this time. This time I wasn't going to be edited out of my own story. I walked into John's study, turned on his lamp, and pulled out the leather notebook we used to keep our household records. In the back, written in his careful script, was a name I didn't recognize until now. Walter Green, attorney, trust everything to him. And so I did. The next morning, I picked up the phone and dialed. Walter Green didn't sound surprised when I introduced myself over the phone. His voice was calm, measured, like someone who had already been waiting. "Have you seen the video?" he asked. "I have," I replied. "Then you know what we're dealing with." He invited me to his office the next morning. For the first time in weeks, I put on lipstick. I wore the navy blue coat John always said made my eyes look like summer water. I walked a little straighter. Walter greeted me with warmth and quiet resolve. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was everything. A full copy of John's final will, a notarized medical evaluation showing he was of sound mind when he signed it, and pages handwritten in John's script detailing every suspicious financial move Brian had made in the last 18 months. There was a wire transfer of $20,000 made while John was in the ECU. There was an audio recording of Brian speaking with a financial planner. "We're looking to move my mom soon, consolidate her assets while she's still able to sign." And then, near the back of the folder, were photographs. Brian and Danielle sitting across from a woman I didn't recognize. In the next image, they were touring a senior living facility. Polite smiles, clipboards, checklists. They were choosing where to put me. Not with me. Not for me. Around me. I left Walter's office with the folder tucked in my bag like armor. That night, I didn't sleep out of fear. I slept out of clarity. They thought I wouldn't fight, that I'd sit quietly while they managed things. They forgot who raised them? The following Sunday, I invited Brian and Danielle over. I told them we should sit down, discuss the estate, get everything in order. They arrived 5 minutes late, as always, coffees in hand, breezy and confident. "Mom, this won't take long," Brian said, patting my shoulder like I was some elderly neighbor who needed help bringing in groceries. "We've already outlined a transition plan," Danielle added, pulling color-coded folders from her tote bag. "You'll have your own balcony and garden access. It's a lovely place, really." They spread papers across the dining room table, budgets, projections, lists of showings scheduled for the house. Brian pushed one toward me. "It's time to simplify, Mom? The market's great. We've already pre-qualified you for the assisted living place." I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I reached into my own tote bag and pulled out the navy blue folder. "What's that?" Brian asked. I opened it slowly, carefully. "Something you forgot to include in your plan," I said. I slid the updated will across the table. Danielle leaned in, her face paled. "Everything to you?" she whispered. I nodded. "Ew." "Yes, everything." And then, I reached for the documents they never thought I'd see. The loan applications. The forged signatures. The photographs. The truth. And in that moment, the air shifted. The room didn't explode. It went quiet. But it was the kind of quiet that comes just before the ground breaks open. They left quietly that day. Brian didn't argue. Danielle didn't slam her chair back or raise her voice. They simply gathered their papers, offered a stiff smile, and said they'd be in touch. They never were. The silence they left behind felt heavier than any shouting match ever could, but it also felt freeing, like the air had cleared, like the house could breathe again. The next morning, I changed the locks. I transferred the utilities back into my name. I met with Walter again, and together we submitted all the necessary documents to probate court. The house was no longer just legally mine, it was symbolically mine again, too. I started cleaning out the closets, not out of necessity but out of choice. I shredded old paperwork, donated unused linens, opened windows that hadn't been opened in years. I took down the framed photos of Brian from the hallway, not out of anger, but to make room for something new. I kept one photo. It was from his 5th birthday. He had chocolate cake on his cheeks and was laughing at something John had said behind the camera. I placed it in the back of a drawer. Not as revenge, but as a reminder. People change. And sometimes they come back. But if they do, they'll have to meet me where I am now. Not where I used to be. I joined the community center's watercolor class on Tuesdays. I started walking each morning with no destination in mind. I learned how to cook for one, and for the first time in a long time I found peace in the quiet. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was something softer. It was mine. A few weeks later, I opened the mailbox and saw an envelope addressed in Brian's handwriting. Inside was a simple card. No apology, no excuses. Just one line, scribbled in his neat, familiar script. "If you're willing, I'd like to talk." I held it in my hands for a long time. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't toss it away, either. I tucked it into my journal, between pages filled with half-finished thoughts and watercolor sketches. I whispered, more to myself than anyone else maybe, but not on your terms. 6 months had passed since that Sunday morning, the day I took my life back without raising my voice. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt settled, rearranged in small ways. I moved the dining table closer to the window where the light hit best. I turned the study into a writing room. I transformed the guest bedroom once saved for Brian's visits into a space for sewing, reading, and being. The silence no longer hurt. It no longer echoed with abandonment. It felt like peace. One Sunday morning, the phone rang. I recognized the number before I picked up. "Hi, Mom," Brian said, his voice quieter than I remembered. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I've started therapy. Danielle and I are separated." He paused. "I don't expect anything. I just thought you should know." I didn't rush to answer. Finally, I said, "I'm glad you're getting help. Would it be okay if I called again sometime?" I paused, then replied, "Yes, but not to talk about the past, only the present. If you want to know me now, you start here." He agreed. And then we hung up. No promises. Just a beginning. That evening, I stood at the kitchen sink, watching the wind move through the garden John and I planted together. The tulips were blooming early this year, red and gold, his favorite colors. I didn't cry. I didn't smile, either. I simply stood there, breathing in the quiet. A few weeks later, Robert stopped by John's best friend, our best man. He brought fresh croissants and didn't ask any questions. "You've made this place feel new again," he said, placing the box on the counter. "It still creaks in all the same places," I replied with a small laugh. He looked out toward the garden. "John would be proud of you." My throat tightened, but I nodded, not because I needed validation but because I believed it too. That spring, Robert helped me build raised garden beds. We painted the edges robin's egg blue. Neighbors stopped to ask what I was growing. I gave them herbs, flowers, and quiet smiles. Not everyone knew what had happened. Not everyone needed to. Because this wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about returning to myself. One afternoon, I sat down at John's old desk, now mine, and opened a document I'd been slowly writing. A memoir. Not for publishing, just for me. And maybe someday, for someone else who needed to know that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to be erased. I titled it The Quiet Room. Because that's where they tried to leave me. And it's where I rose from. If you've ever felt like someone tried to erase you, your love, your voice, your presence, I want to say this. You're still here. You still matter. And your story isn't over. If this spoke to something inside you, you're welcome to share in the comments. Or simply say, "I'm still here." Sometimes saying that out loud is a kind of healing.